I thought I knew my neighbor, until her aunt smiled at me like she already knew exactly what I wanted. The first time I really noticed her, I didn't even realize I was staring. She wasn't just my neighbor's aunt, she was a presence, quietly commanding attention without ever trying. She had this effortless grace, the kind that made every movement feel deliberate, even in something as mundane as watering her small garden or adjusting a flower pot. The sunlight caught her hair in gentle highlights, giving it a soft, almost golden glow that made her look like she belonged in a painting rather than in the cluttered chaos of my suburban street. She smirked the first time our eyes met, a subtle, knowing curl of her lips that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't a smirk of mockery, far from it. It was the kind of look that made it clear she noticed more than I intended to reveal, like she could see through the careful walls I built around myself. And somehow, it felt comforting, like someone had finally seen the part of me I usually kept hidden. When she spoke, it was always measured, warm, and calm. Her voice carried a soft richness, almost like music layered over words, and I found myself listening longer than necessary, straining to catch the subtle inflections, the small laughs that slipped out at unexpected moments. She didn't fill the silence, but she didn't let it become awkward either. She had a way of letting space linger, and in that space, I felt drawn closer. I remember the first touch vividly, even though it was accidental. Her hand brushed mine as she handed me a small envelope from the mailbox, a fleeting contact that sent an odd warmth up my arm. It was nothing by itself, but the memory lingered, like a quiet echo in my mind that refused to fade. The soft weight of her palm, the smoothness of her skin, the faint scent of her perfume, vanilla, light and comforting, all of it combined into a sensation that was both confusing and exhilarating. From that moment on, every interaction carried an undercurrent of something unspoken. Her presence made ordinary things feel charged, watching her adjust the blinds, laughing at a neighbor's joke, or simply walking across the lawn. I couldn't stop thinking about her smirk, the way her eyes flickered with quiet amusement, and the sense that she already knew exactly what I wanted, even before I did. It was subtle, and it unnervingly captivated me, leaving me wondering how one person could have such a quiet, profound effect on another in just a single glance. By the end of that day, I realized that my neighbor's aunt wasn't just someone I noticed, I was already, in ways I didn't fully understand, drawn to her. After that first fleeting moment, every encounter with her felt charged in ways I couldn't name. It wasn't that we spent time together deliberately, far from it. Most of our interactions were accidental, little collisions of circumstance that made my heart beat a little faster each time. Passing her in the hallway when retrieving the mail, exchanging polite greetings in the garden, or helping her carry groceries from her car, each mundane action suddenly seemed layered with tension I couldn't ignore. She had this uncanny ability to notice details about me I didn't even realize I was revealing. The way she tilted her head when she spoke, as if she were reading something hidden behind my words. The tiny quirks in my voice when I laughed. Even the subtle hesitation in my steps when I walked toward her. It wasn't invasive, more like she quietly understood me, and the awareness made me simultaneously nervous and drawn to her. One afternoon, as I helped her carry a stack of books into the house, our hands brushed. It was subtle, almost accidental, but the warmth of her skin against mine lingered far longer than it should have. I felt an almost tangible current, a quiet electricity that made me acutely aware of the space between us. She didn't pull away immediately, her fingers lingered just slightly longer than necessary, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. I had to fight the urge to look at her hands, at the slight curve of her wrist, at the way the sunlight hit the soft fabric of her sleeve. Her laughter had become something I craved, though I would never admit it. A chuckle at a neighbor's offhand joke, a quiet laugh at something I said, small, unassuming moments that made the world feel warmer. There was a softness in her voice, a musical quality that wrapped around me, making even the briefest conversations feel significant. Even simple gestures, her brushing stray hair behind her ear, adjusting the strap of her bag, or stepping slightly closer to pass through a narrow doorway, made my senses alert. Each movement carried a quiet intimacy that I couldn't shake, and I found myself reading more into her subtle smiles, her smirks, the way her eyes sometimes held mine just a heartbeat too long. And yet, there was always this awareness, this hesitation, in the back of my mind. The age difference, the social boundaries, the unspoken rules, all of it pressed on me. I wanted to step closer, to linger in those moments, but I hesitated, unsure of where her awareness ended and her intentions began. By the end of the week, I realized that the ordinary had become extraordinary in her presence. Every accidental touch, every brief glance, every soft laugh made my thoughts spiral in ways I hadn't anticipated. I couldn't tell if it was infatuation or something deeper, but I knew one thing: she had already taken residence in my mind, and she wasn't leaving anytime soon. It was a quiet evening when our interaction shifted in a way I didn't fully expect. I had stopped by to return a borrowed book, and she invited me to stay for tea. There was nothing unusual about it. On the surface, it was simply hospitality, but the atmosphere felt different somehow, charged with an intimacy that hadn't been there before. As I settled into the chair across from her, I noticed the way the lamplight caught the gentle lines around her eyes, softening her confident exterior and revealing a quiet vulnerability I hadn't seen before. She spoke about something personal, a small story about her past that she rarely shared with anyone. Her voice was calm, steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, a hint of emotion she wasn't quite masking. I listened intently, absorbing every nuance, the way her fingers twisted slightly in her lap, the subtle pause before she spoke, the faint sigh that escaped her lips at the memory. It was the kind of moment that demanded attention, that made the rest of the world fade until only she existed. There was a softness in her gaze that I had never noticed before, a quiet invitation to understand her beyond the surface. I realized, with an odd mix of hesitation and thrill, that she was trusting me in a way most people never would. It made my chest ache with a combination of awe and longing. I wanted to respond, to offer words of comfort or understanding, but I also didn't want to break the fragile intimacy of the moment with something clumsy or thoughtless. At one point, our hands nearly met across the table. A simple reach for the sugar bowl brought our fingers close, and I felt a warmth spread through my palm, subtle but undeniable. She didn't pull away immediately. Our eyes met, and I saw the faintest acknowledgement in her smile, a recognition of the tension between us without words. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, a quiet confirmation that there was more beneath the surface than either of us had admitted. I left that evening with my thoughts tangled, replaying every detail, the way she had looked at me, the softness in her voice, the brief brush of our hands. It was no longer just curiosity or attraction, it had become a quiet understanding, a subtle confession of feelings neither of us dared say aloud. From that day on, the world felt slightly different whenever I thought of her. Every glance, every word, every accidental touch carried the weight of that shared vulnerability. The slow burn had begun, and with it came the realization that our connection was no longer accidental, it was deliberate, intimate, and quietly powerful. After that evening, I found myself noticing her in ways I hadn't before. It wasn't just the obvious, her graceful movements, her warm smile, but the subtle things that lingered in the corner of my mind, small details that made her presence feel larger than life. I caught myself analyzing the way she tilted her head when listening, how her eyebrows lifted ever so slightly when she was amused, or how her lips curved into a smirk when she seemed to understand something I had tried to hide. Each observation was a quiet thrill, a small, private acknowledgement of the magnetic pull she had over me. I became acutely aware of the space she occupied. Even when she was across the room, arranging flowers or organizing her kitchen, there was a rhythm to her movements that made the mundane feel alive. The rustle of her clothing as she bent to lift something, the soft click of her shoes on the floor, the faint brush of air when she passed by, it all seemed to resonate more than it should, as if my senses were tuned exclusively to her. The tension between us was subtle but undeniable. Sometimes our hands brushed accidentally while reaching for the same object, and each time, a quiet warmth spread through me. It wasn't just physical, it was the awareness of proximity, of shared space, that made my pulse quicken. There was an unspoken conversation in those moments, a silent acknowledgement that both of us recognized something unspoken, something fragile yet compelling. Her laughter became a melody I noticed more acutely, the way it rose softly and lingered in the air, leaving a trace of warmth long after the sound faded. And when she looked at me, even briefly, it felt like the world paused. Her eyes were thoughtful, teasing, and sometimes filled with a quiet curiosity that mirrored my own. I found myself analyzing every expression, every glance, wondering how much of it was intentional and how much was instinctual. At the same time, hesitation weighed heavily on me. I understood the implications of my growing fascination, the age difference, the delicate boundaries, the social norms that made my feelings complicated. I wanted to step closer, to let her presence fully envelop me, but I held back, wary of crossing lines that weren't meant to be crossed yet. By the end of the week, I realized that my awareness of her had evolved. I wasn't just observing her, I was learning her rhythm, her subtle cues, her quiet language of emotion. The attraction wasn't just physical, it was an intimate understanding, a slow, deliberate connection that neither of us had admitted, but both of us felt. And in that delicate balance of observation and restraint, the tension between us grew, quietly powerful, and impossible to ignore. There was a moment I knew was inevitable, the one where the tension we had been dancing around would no longer remain silent. It happened unexpectedly, in the quiet of her kitchen one afternoon, as we were arranging the last of the spring flowers in vases. The sunlight streamed through the window, catching the highlights in her hair and casting a warm glow across her face. She glanced at me, smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, and I felt that familiar pull in my chest, the one I had tried to ignore. "I know exactly what you're thinking," she said softly, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The words hit me with more force than I expected. For a moment, I froze, unsure whether to laugh, protest, or simply melt under the weight of her gaze. It wasn't teasing in a cruel way, there was a vulnerability beneath her confidence, a hint that she, too, was acknowledging the connection we had both felt but avoided naming. I opened my mouth, but the words felt inadequate, tripping over themselves as they struggled to convey the mix of curiosity, desire, and hesitation I felt. My hands lingered near hers as I reached for a vase, the proximity sending a rush of warmth up my arm. She didn't move away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, allowing our fingers to brush just enough to make my pulse race. The subtle contact was electric, and yet tender, a confirmation of unspoken truths neither of us dared speak aloud. Her smile softened as she stepped closer, and I realized she was testing the boundaries of how far this moment could stretch. "You don't have to hide it," she murmured, her voice low, intimate, yet steady. It was the kind of reassurance that left me both grounded and unsteady at the same time. I wanted to confess, to say everything I had been holding back, but fear lingered, fear of crossing lines, of saying too much too soon, of ruining the fragile trust we had built. Instead, we settled into a quiet tension, a delicate dance of acknowledgement. Our shared glances, the subtle brushing of hands, the almost imperceptible leaning toward each other, it all spoke volumes without a single overt declaration. I became hyper-aware of her scent, a soft mix of vanilla and something warm and familiar, of the gentle brush of her sleeve against my arm, and of the faint tremor in her fingers as she adjusted a vase. By the time the moment passed, I was left breathless, acutely conscious of the emotional walls we had both lowered. For the first time, it felt real, not fantasy, not fleeting, but an undeniable connection that existed in the space between us. We hadn't crossed the line, yet the line itself had shifted, becoming something malleable, fragile, and infinitely more intimate. That afternoon, I realized the truth, the tension wasn't going away. It had only deepened, carrying with it a promise, an unspoken invitation to explore the quiet, powerful bond forming between us. After the confrontation, our dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. There was no grand declaration, no rushed confession, just a quiet understanding that the space between us had changed, and every interaction carried new weight. It began with small, intentional moments, a shared cup of tea in the garden, her guiding hand as we trimmed overgrown plants, or sitting side by side on the porch swing while the sun dipped low in the sky. Each gesture was simple, yet it held a depth I could feel in my chest. One afternoon, we cooked together in her kitchen. I had always enjoyed these little domestic errands, but now they felt charged with a gentle intimacy. She handed me ingredients, her fingers brushing mine as we worked in tandem. There was a warmth in that contact, a softness that lingered long after the moment passed. The scent of herbs and spices mingled with the faint trace of her perfume, and I noticed every subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes softened when she laughed, the small, almost imperceptible way she leaned closer when she explained a recipe. We began to talk more deeply about life, our dreams, regrets, and quiet fears. She spoke with a wisdom that made her world-weariness seem like a comfort rather than a burden. I listened, sometimes offering insights from my younger perspective, and she responded with thoughtful nods or gentle smiles that made me feel seen in ways I had never experienced. There was a rhythm to our conversation, a natural ebb and flow that didn't rush, didn't demand, yet carried a weight that felt profound. Even casual touches began to carry meaning, the brushing of shoulders while reaching for the same dish, leaning slightly against each other while reading, or the fleeting warmth of our hands meeting as we carried baskets of laundry. Each contact was tender, deliberate, and entirely non-sexual, yet it stirred emotions that were difficult to articulate. There was a sense of trust, a shared understanding that we could explore closeness without fear or judgment. Her laughter became a private melody I anticipated eagerly. When she smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling gently, it sent a warmth through me that no words could capture. And when she rested her head lightly on my shoulder during a quiet moment on the porch, it felt like time had slowed, her steady presence grounding me while also stirring a quiet, thrilling tension that neither of us ignored. By the end of these afternoons, I realized that the connection between us had deepened far beyond attraction. It was an intimate, respectful bond, gentle, tender, and unhurried. Every glance, touch, and shared silence had become a form of exploration, a slow, deliberate discovery of trust and affection that promised something lasting, subtle, and undeniably powerful. After weeks of quiet understanding and subtle gestures, the connection between us finally felt fully realized. There was no dramatic declaration, no rushing towards something that needed time to grow. Instead, it was in the everyday moments, the soft smiles shared across the kitchen counter, the lingering glances when one of us entered a room, the warmth of her hand brushing mine as we walked through the garden. Every small action carried meaning, a shared language of affection that neither words nor social conventions could fully capture. One late afternoon, we found ourselves on the porch swing, the sky streaked with the pink and gold hues of sunset. She rested her head lightly on my shoulder, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat beneath her. Her presence was grounding, yet it stirred a delicate tension that had become familiar, comforting, and intoxicating all at once. I realized that I could stay like this indefinitely, simply sharing space with her, letting the quiet intimacy between us speak louder than any words ever could. We talked about life in ways that felt deeply honest, our regrets, our hopes, the lessons learned from years apart. I listened as she reflected on experiences that had shaped her, and I shared my youthful perspectives in return. It wasn't about impressing one another, it was about understanding, connecting, and accepting each other fully. There was a vulnerability in these moments, a gentle transparency that made our bond feel unbreakable. Even physical closeness had settled into a tender rhythm. Her hand sometimes found mine in casual gestures, our shoulders brushed as we moved around the kitchen, and occasional hugs carried the weight of comfort, trust, and quiet longing. There was no need for overt gestures, every touch was deliberate, every glance deliberate, every pause in conversation weighted with meaning. It was a romance built on mutual respect, understanding, and subtle, unspoken desire. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, we sat in silence, watching the sky fade into twilight. The warmth of her presence enveloped me, a reminder that this connection wasn't fleeting or superficial, it was real, enduring, and profoundly human. The tension that had once made me restless had transformed into a gentle comfort, a steady, intimate rhythm that felt like home. I understood, fully, that this story was not about dramatic revelations or fleeting passion. It was about two people, drawn together by subtle glances, quiet touches, and shared vulnerabilities, discovering an emotional depth that neither of us had expected but both had silently yearned for. And in that quiet, golden moment, I knew that what we had built, our slow-burn, age-gap romance, was complete, lasting, and quietly perfect. As the twilight settled around us, I realized how much these quiet moments had changed me, and I wanted you to feel every heartbeat, every glance, every subtle touch along the way. If you've ever been captivated by a connection that grows slowly, quietly, and completely, make sure to watch the full story. Link in the description for the full journey of a slow burn, age gap romance that lingers long after the last glance.